I'm Sarah Mitchell, and at 29 years old, I never imagined I'd be the person to turn my back on my own brother's fight for his life. But when my father looked me dead in the eye and said, "You're dead to us," after everything I'd sacrificed for our family, I knew exactly what I had to do. That very night, I called Springfield General Hospital and canceled the $20,000 cancer treatment plan I'd been funding for my brother David. The money I'd worked 60-hour weeks to save, the inheritance from my grandmother that I'd given up my own dreams to spend on his care, all of it stopped with one phone call that would shatter our family forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Springfield, Ohio, I was always what you'd call the responsible one. While my older brother David was out partying through college and jumping from job to job, I was the one who stayed close to home, got my marketing degree from the local community college, and landed a steady position at Midwest Insurance Group right here in town. Our parents, Bob and Linda Mitchell, had raised us in a small ranch house on Maple Street, where Dad worked 30 years at the GM plant before it closed down, and Mom kept books for Henderson Accounting on the weekends to make ends meet. David had always been the golden child, even though he was 2 years older than me. He was charming in that effortless way that made people overlook his flaws. The way he'd borrow money and forget to pay it back, how he'd disappear for weeks without calling home, or how he'd show up to family dinners with some new girlfriend who'd be gone by next month. But whenever David walked into a room, Dad's whole face would light up. "There's my boy," he'd say, like David had just returned from war instead of another weekend bender in Columbus. Me? I was dependable, Sarah. The one who never missed a family dinner, who helped Mom with the grocery shopping when her arthritis flared up, who drove Dad to his doctor appointments when his blood pressure medication made him dizzy. I was the one who remembered birthdays and anniversaries, who organized the family reunions, and who somehow always ended up being the mediator when David's latest crisis sent shockwaves through our quiet household. Don't get me wrong, I loved my brother. It wasn't an exciting life by most standards, but it was mine, and I was content with the routine and stability it provided. David, meanwhile, had bounced around between different cities and jobs for most of his 20s. He'd tried sales, construction, even a brief stint as a personal trainer at a gym in Toledo. Nothing seemed to stick, and he'd inevitably end up back home every few months, sleeping in his old bedroom while he, quote, figured things out. Mom would cook his favorite meals and do his laundry, while Dad would make phone calls to his old buddies trying to find David work at various factories around the area. It was during one of these homecoming periods, about 2 years ago, that David met Jessica Crawford at a bar downtown. Jessica was different from his usual type. She was quiet where his other girlfriends had been loud, practical where they'd been impulsive. She worked as a nurse's aide at Springfield General and seemed to have a calming effect on David's chaotic energy. For the first time in years, he stayed in one place for more than a few months, got a steady job at the hardware store, and even started talking about settling down. Our parents were thrilled. Mom started making not-so-subtle hints about grandchildren, and Dad began including Jessica in family discussions about David's future. When they got married in a small ceremony at our church last fall, I was genuinely happy for them. Maybe Jessica would be the anchor David needed to finally get his life together. Maybe our family dynamics would shift into something healthier with her steadying influence. For a while, it seemed like things were working. David and Jessica moved into a small duplex near the hospital where she worked, and he seemed more focused than I'd ever seen him. He showed up for family dinners on time, remembered to call Mom on her birthday, and even helped Dad clean out the garage one weekend without being asked. It felt like we were finally becoming the functional family I'd always wanted us to be. I should have known it was too good to last. The first sign that something was wrong came on a sunny Tuesday morning in March. I was at my desk, reviewing ad copy for our spring campaign, when my phone rang. It was Jessica, and her voice was shaking so badly I could barely understand her. "Sarah, can you meet me at the hospital? Something's wrong with David." I didn't even stop to grab my purse. I told Kate there was a family emergency and drove straight to Springfield General, my heart pounding the entire way. I found Jessica in the waiting room of the emergency department, still wearing her scrubs from the night shift she'd just finished. Her face was pale and her hands were trembling as she clutched a cup of coffee that had clearly gone cold hours ago. "What happened?" I asked, sitting down beside her and taking her hand. "He's been feeling tired for weeks," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I kept telling him to see a doctor, but you know how he is about medical stuff." Then this morning, he collapsed in the shower. "I found him unconscious, Sarah. There was blood." The next few hours passed in a blur of medical tests, concerned-looking doctors, and that awful hospital waiting room that smelled like disinfectant and fear. Our parents arrived within an hour, Mom clutching Dad's arm like she might fall down without his support. We sat together in uncomfortable silence, each lost in our own thoughts and fears about what the doctors might tell us. When Dr. Patricia Hoffman finally emerged from the examination rooms, her expression was grave, but not hopeless. She was a woman in her early 40s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the sort of calm demeanor that probably served her well when delivering life-changing news to families like ours. "David has been diagnosed with stage 3 Hodgkin's lymphoma," she said, settling into the chair across from us. "It's a type of blood cancer that affects the lymphatic system. The good news is that Hodgkin's lymphoma has a high cure rate, especially in someone David's age. The challenging news is that his particular case is aggressive and will require intensive treatment." The words seemed to echo in the sterile waiting room. Cancer. My brother, who'd always seemed invincible despite his reckless lifestyle, had cancer. I watched my mother's face crumble as Dad pulled her closer, his own eyes filling with tears he was trying not to shed. Jessica just stared at the doctor like she was speaking a foreign language. Dr. Hoffman continued explaining the treatment plan. David would need 6 months of chemotherapy, followed by radiation therapy. The standard treatment was covered by his insurance through Jessica's job at the hospital, but there was... Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. There was also an experimental immunotherapy protocol that had shown remarkable results in cases like his. The immunotherapy could potentially cut his treatment time in half and significantly reduce the long-term side effects of traditional chemotherapy. What would that cost? I asked, the practical part of my brain already calculating while my heart was still trying to process the fact that my brother might die. The immunotherapy protocol runs about $20,000 after insurance, Dr. Hoffman said. I know that's a significant amount, but I wanted you to be aware of all the options available to David. $20,000. It might as well have been $20 million for our family. Dad's pension from GM wasn't generous, and Mom's part-time bookkeeping job barely covered their basic expenses. David and Jessica were just starting out, living paycheck to paycheck like most young couples in small-town Ohio. There was no way they could come up with that kind of money, and I could see the defeat settling over my family like a heavy blanket. We'll manage with the regular treatment, Dad said, his voice rough with emotion. The important thing is that David gets well. But as we sat there in that waiting room, I kept thinking about my grandmother's inheritance sitting in my savings account. $15,000, plus the $5,000 I'd managed to save from my job over the past year. $20,000 exactly. It felt like more than coincidence. It felt like fate. That night, I lay awake in my apartment, staring at the ceiling while Pepper purred contentedly beside me. I thought about David teaching me to ride a bike, about all the times he'd made me laugh when I was sad, about the way he'd protected me from bullies in elementary school even though he was barely bigger than me. I thought about Grandma Rose and how she'd always said family was the most important thing in the world. I thought about the pottery classes I'd have to give up, the master's degree I'd have to postpone, the down payment on a house that would have to wait. By morning, I'd made my decision. I called Dr. Hoffman's office first thing and told them I wanted to discuss the immunotherapy option for David. Then I called my bank and started the process of transferring my savings. I didn't tell anyone in my family what I was planning. I wanted it to be a surprise, a way to show David and my parents that I would do anything to help our family through this crisis. Looking back now, I realized that decision marked the beginning of the end of everything I thought I knew about the people I loved most. But in that moment, sitting in my small apartment with the morning sun streaming through my windows, I felt like I was finally doing something that mattered. I was going to save my brother's life, and nothing else seemed important compared to that. I had no idea that within 6 months, those same people would look me in the eye and tell me I was dead to them. I had no idea that my greatest act of love would become the weapon they'd use to destroy me. But that morning, full of hope and determination, I started making phone calls that would change everything. The morning I walked into Dr. Hoffman's office to finalize the payment for David's immunotherapy, I felt like I was carrying the weight of our entire family's future in my hands. The check for $20,000 represented every penny I had in the world, but as I handed it to the billing coordinator, I felt nothing but peace. This was what family meant, sacrificing for each other when it mattered most. "Miss Mitchell, this is incredibly generous," Dr. Hoffman said when she learned about my decision. "David is lucky to have a sister like you. This treatment protocol could make all the difference in his recovery timeline and long-term prognosis." I asked her not to tell David or my parents that I was funding the treatment. I wanted to surprise them once everything was arranged. The coordinator assured me that patient privacy laws meant they couldn't disclose payment sources anyway, but they would make sure David understood he was receiving the best possible care. When I called Mom that evening to let her know David had been approved for the advanced treatment, the joy in her voice made every sacrifice worth it. "Oh, Sarah, this is a miracle," she cried. "I don't know how this happened, but God must be watching over our family. David's going to be okay." Dad got on the phone, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't understand how insurance approved the expensive treatment, but I'm not going to question it. This gives David the best possible chance." I could hear the relief washing over him, and I smiled to myself, imagining how surprised and grateful they'd all be when they eventually learned the truth. The treatment began 2 weeks later, and those first few months felt like the closest our family had ever been. I drove David to his appointments when Jessica couldn't get time off work, sat with him during the lengthy infusion sessions, and helped research dietary changes that might support his recovery. Mom would pack elaborate lunches for his treatment days, convinced that her homemade soup could somehow boost the medicine's effectiveness. David handled the immunotherapy remarkably well compared to what we'd expected from traditional chemotherapy. His energy levels remained relatively stable, he didn't lose his hair, and the side effects were manageable. Dr. Hoffman was thrilled with his response to the treatment, telling us at each follow-up that his numbers were improving ahead of schedule. "Whatever guardian angel arranged for David to get this treatment deserves a medal," she told our family during one of his appointments. "He's responding exactly as we hoped, and if this continues, he'll be in full remission months sooner than with conventional therapy." I caught Jessica's eye across the room and smiled. She'd been such a steady presence through David's illness, never complaining about the extra responsibilities or the stress of watching someone you love fight for their life. She worked double shifts to make up for the income David lost when he couldn't work full-time at the hardware store. And she managed his medication schedule with the precision of a military operation. During those months, I felt closer to my family than I ever had before. David and I would talk for hours during his treatment sessions about everything from childhood memories to his plans for the future. He talked about wanting to have children with Jessica once he was healthy, maybe opening his own business instead of working for someone else. The illness had given him a clarity about what mattered that I'd never seen in him before. "I keep thinking about how short life is," he told me one afternoon as the immunotherapy dripped slowly into his arm. "All those years I wasted jumping from job to job, never committing to anything. When I get through this, I want to build something real. Maybe start a contracting business, Use these hands for something that lasts." I squeezed his other hand, fighting back tears. "You're going to beat this, David. And when you do, you can build whatever you want. The world is going to be yours." Our parents seemed to age backwards during this period, as hope replaced the crushing fear that had consumed them since David's diagnosis. Dad started planning projects around the house that he wanted David to help him with once he was fully recovered. Mom began researching healthy recipes and talking about redecorating David and Jessica's duplex as a recovery celebration. The financial sacrifice was significant for me, but manageable. I'd moved to a smaller apartment to save on rent, given up the pottery classes and the dinners out with friends. I drove an older car and shopped at thrift stores, but none of it felt like hardship when I could see David getting stronger each week. I'd even started picking up freelance marketing projects in the evenings to build my savings back up slowly. My friend Amanda thought I was crazy to give up so much for David's treatment. "Sarah, you can't set yourself on fire to keep other people warm," she'd tell me over coffee. "Your brother is an adult, and so are your parents. They need to figure out their own solutions." But Amanda had grown up in a family where everyone looked out for themselves first. She couldn't understand that some families operated differently, that sometimes love meant making sacrifices without keeping score. I tried to explain that David would do the same for me if our situations were reversed, though privately I wondered if that was really true. The first hint that something was shifting in our family dynamics came during David's 4th month of treatment. I'd arrived at their duplex to pick him up for his appointment, as I did every Tuesday and Friday, when I overheard Jessica on the phone in their bedroom. "I know it's hard, Mom, but David's treatment is going so well," she was saying. "The doctors say he might be in remission by Christmas. It's just been stressful managing everything while he's been sick." I assumed she was talking to her own mother, who lived in Pennsylvania and called regularly to check on David's progress. But then I heard something that made me freeze in the hallway. "Sarah's been helpful, but honestly, she can be a little overwhelming sometimes. She acts like she's in charge of everything related to David's care, and it makes me feel like I'm not doing enough as his wife." My stomach dropped. I'd thought Jessica appreciated my help with driving David to appointments and staying with him during treatments. I'd never considered that she might see my involvement as interference rather than support. "I just wish his family would give us some space to handle this ourselves, you know. They mean well, but sometimes it feels like they don't trust me to take care of my own husband." I quietly backed toward the front door and knocked loudly, calling out that I was there to pick up David. When Jessica emerged from the bedroom, she greeted me with the same warm smile she always wore, giving no indication of the conversation I'd just overheard. During the drive to the hospital, I found myself studying David's profile as he dozed in the passenger seat. The treatment was working, his color was better, and he'd even gained back some of the weight he'd lost before his diagnosis. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was changing in our family, something I couldn't quite identify. The second warning sign came a few weeks later during one of our Sunday family dinners. These weekly gatherings had become even more important since David's diagnosis, a way for all of us to stay connected and monitor his progress. Mom always cooked David's favorite foods, and Dad would update us on his latest research about cancer treatment and recovery. That particular Sunday, David seemed unusually quiet during dinner. When Mom asked about his week, he gave short answers and avoided making eye contact with anyone. Jessica kept glancing at him nervously, like she was waiting for him to say something specific. "Everything okay, son?" Dad asked, setting down his fork and studying David's face. "You seem like something's bothering you." David looked at Jessica, who gave him an almost imperceptible nod before turning back to our parents. "Actually, there is something Jessica and I have been wanting to talk to you all about." The tone of his voice made my chest tighten with anxiety. After months of good news about his treatment progress, I wasn't prepared for whatever was coming next. "We've been thinking about making some changes after I finish treatment," David continued, still not looking directly at me. "Jessica got offered a position at a hospital in Columbus, and we're thinking about taking it. The pay is better, and it would give us a chance to start fresh, somewhere new." Mom's face fell immediately. "Columbus? But that's 2 hours away. What about your treatment? What about finishing your recovery here where Dr. Hoffman can monitor you?" "The treatment will be finished by then," Jessica said gently. "And there are excellent oncologists in Columbus for follow-up care. It would be a good opportunity for both of us to build careers in a bigger city." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. After everything I'd sacrificed to make sure David got the best possible treatment right here in Springfield, they were planning to leave town the moment he was healthy? It felt like they were running away from the family that had supported them through the worst crisis of their lives. "I think it sounds like a great opportunity," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady even though my hands were shaking under the table. "You should do whatever feels right for your future." But even as I said the words, I felt a deep sense of betrayal beginning to take root. I'd given up my entire savings, my plans for graduate school, my dreams of homeownership, to make sure David could access the treatment that was now saving his life. And his response was to plan an escape to another city where our family couldn't continue to support him? Dad was asking practical questions about timing and logistics, but I barely heard the conversation. I kept thinking about all the evening hours I'd spent researching David's condition, all the treatment appointments I'd rearranged my work schedule to attend, all the ways I'd reorganized my entire life around his recovery. Had any of that mattered to him, or had he just seen it as something he was entitled to receive? After dinner, as we were clearing the table, David pulled me aside in the kitchen. "Sarah, I hope you're not upset about the Columbus thing. It's not about running away from family. It's about Jessica and me building our own life together." I looked at my brother, this person I'd loved and protected my entire life, and realized that something had fundamentally changed between us. Whether it was the illness, the stress of treatment, or something else entirely, we weren't the same siblings who used to build forts in our backyard and share secrets under the covers after bedtime. "I want you to be happy, David," I told him, and I meant it. "I just hope you remember how much everyone here loves you and wants to be part of your life." He hugged me then, the same way he had when we were kids, and he was apologizing for breaking one of my toys or eating the last cookie I'd been saving. But this time, the hug felt different. It felt like goodbye. That night, lying in my small apartment with Pepper curled against my side, I stared at the ceiling and tried to understand what was happening to our family. David was getting better, which was all that really mattered, but something precious was being lost in the process. The closeness we'd shared during his illness, the sense that we were all fighting this battle together, seemed to be dissolving as quickly as it had formed. I told myself I was being selfish, but David and Jessica deserved to make their own choices about their future without interference from his family. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being erased from a story I'd helped write, dismissed from a life I'd helped save. The third and most unsettling warning sign came during David's final month of treatment. His progress had been so remarkable that Dr. Hoffman was able to reduce the frequency of his appointments, and his energy levels were almost back to normal. He'd even started working part-time at the hardware store again, gradually rebuilding his strength and routine. I was at work late one evening, finishing up a campaign proposal that was due the next morning, when my phone buzzed with a text from David. "Can you come over? Jessica's working nights this week, and I could use some company." I was exhausted and looking forward to going home and collapsing in front of the television, but David rarely asked for anything directly. Throughout his treatment, he'd always been stoic about the emotional challenges of fighting cancer, so if he was reaching out for support, I knew it must be important. When I arrived at their duplex, I found David sitting on the couch with a beer in his hand and a strange expression on his face. He looked healthier than he had in months, but there was something in his eyes that I couldn't quite read. "Thanks for coming over," he said, gesturing for me to sit down. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately, and there are some things I need to say to you." I settled into the chair across from him, suddenly nervous about the serious tone in his voice. "What's going on, David? Is everything okay with your treatment?" "Treatment's going great," he said, taking a long sip of his beer. "Dr. Hoffman says I'll probably be declared in full remission at my next appointment. The immunotherapy worked exactly like she hoped it would." "That's wonderful news," I said, though his tone suggested this conversation was heading somewhere less celebratory. David set down his beer and leaned forward, fixing me with a direct stare that reminded me uncomfortably of our father when he was about to deliver bad news. "Sarah, I know what you did." My heart stopped. "What do you mean?" "I know you paid for the immunotherapy. Jessica figured it out weeks ago when she was reviewing our insurance paperwork. There's no way our policy would have covered that treatment, and when she asked the billing department directly, they confirmed that someone had made a private payment to cover the full cost." I felt heat rising in my cheeks, though I wasn't sure if it was embarrassment at being discovered or anger at being confronted like this. "David, I don't understand why you're upset. I wanted to help. I wanted you to have the best possible chance at beating this." "I'm not upset that you helped," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "I'm upset that you lied about it. You let all of us believe that insurance had approved the treatment, when you knew damn well that wasn't true. You made me feel like a charity case, Sarah." The accusation hit me like a slap. "A charity case? David, you're my brother. I love you. I wanted to make sure you got well, and I had the money to make that happen. How does that make you a charity case?" "Because you didn't ask," he said, his voice rising slightly. "You didn't discuss it with me or Jessica, or even Mom and Dad. You just decided on your own that we couldn't handle our own problems, and you swooped in to save us without even telling us what you were doing." I stared at him in disbelief. "You're angry that I saved your life without asking permission first?" "I'm angry that you treated me like a child who couldn't make his own decisions about his own cancer treatment." David shot back. Do you have any idea how it feels to find out that your little sister has been secretly paying for your medical care? That everything I thought was working out for my family was actually just you pulling strings behind the scenes? The conversation was spiraling into territory I'd never imagined. In all my planning and sacrificing, it had never occurred to me that David might see my help as an insult rather than an act of love. David, I never meant to make you feel that way, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. I just wanted to help. I saw that you needed something, and I had the means to provide it. Isn't that what family does for each other? Family talks to each other, he said firmly. Family makes decisions together. They don't make unilateral choices about other people's lives and then lie about it for months. I felt tears starting to gather in my eyes, but I blinked them back. So what do you want me to do, David? Do you want me to take back the money? Because it's too late for that. The treatment is almost finished. And it worked. You're going to live. Isn't that what matters? David stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the dark street. What matters is that you robbed me of the chance to fight my own battles. What matters is that you made Jessica feel like she wasn't capable of taking care of her own husband. What matters is that you turned our family crisis into your personal heroics project. The words cut deeper than I'd expected. I'd thought I was being selfless, but according to David, I'd actually been selfish, taking control of a situation that wasn't mine to control. I'm sorry, I said quietly. I truly didn't mean to hurt you or Jessica. I just wanted to help. David turned back to face me, and for a moment his expression softened. I know you meant well, Sarah. I know you love me. But love isn't supposed to come with strings attached, and it's not supposed to make people feel small. We sat in uncomfortable silence for several minutes, the weight of his words settling between us like a wall that hadn't existed an hour earlier. What happens now? I asked finally. Now I finish my treatment and get on with my life, David said. And hopefully you can find a way to get on with yours without trying to manage everyone else's problems. I left their duplex that night feeling more confused and hurt than I had since David's initial diagnosis. I'd expected gratitude, maybe even tears of appreciation when David learned about my sacrifice. Instead, I'd been made to feel like I'd done something wrong, like my love and generosity were character flaws rather than virtues. But as I drove home through the quiet streets of Springfield, I couldn't shake the feeling that David's anger was about more than just my payment for his treatment. Something deeper was shifting in our family dynamic, something that had been building throughout his illness and recovery. I just couldn't figure out what it was or how to fix it. That night, I lay awake wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake, not in paying for David's treatment, but in believing that my family would see my sacrifice as an expression of love rather than an act of control. For the first time since his diagnosis, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about the people I loved most in the world. The weeks following my confrontation with David felt like walking through a minefield, where every family interaction could explode without warning. The easy closeness we'd shared during his treatment had been replaced by a careful politeness that felt worse than outright hostility. David still came to Sunday dinners, but he sat farther away from me at the table and avoided making eye contact during conversations. Jessica had become even more distant, speaking to me only when absolutely necessary, and always with a coolness that made it clear she blamed me for overstepping boundaries she felt I should have respected. When I offered to drive David to his final few treatment appointments, she politely declined, saying they preferred to handle it themselves. The message was unmistakable. My help was no longer wanted or needed. Mom and Dad remained blissfully unaware of the tension brewing beneath the surface. They were so focused on David's remarkable recovery that they didn't notice the way he flinched slightly whenever I entered a room, or how Jessica's smile never quite reached her eyes when she looked at me anymore. To them, everything was perfect. Their son was beating cancer, and the family was stronger than ever, but I felt like I was slowly disappearing from my own family's story. The breaking point came 3 weeks before David's final treatment appointment, during what should have been a celebration dinner. Dr. Hoffman had confirmed that David was officially in remission, with cancer cell counts so low they were practically undetectable. Mom had insisted on hosting a special dinner to mark the milestone, complete with David's favorite chocolate cake and sparkling cider for toasts. I arrived at my parents' house that evening with a carefully wrapped gift, a leather-bound journal I'd bought for David to document his thoughts and experiences as he transitioned from patient to survivor. I'd seen him writing occasionally during his treatment sessions and thought he might want to continue processing his journey through writing. The mood in the house was jubilant. Dad had strung up lights in the dining room, and Mom had spent the entire day cooking David's favorite foods. When I walked into the living room, I found David and Jessica sitting close together on the couch, looking at something on Jessica's phone and laughing quietly together. "Sarah's here," Mom called from the kitchen, where she was putting finishing touches on the dinner. "David, come help me carry these dishes to the table." As we gathered around the dining room table, I felt the familiar warmth of family tradition. Dad said grace, thanking God for David's healing and for the family that had supported him through his illness. Mom beamed as she served generous portions of pot roast and mashed potatoes. For a moment, it felt like we were back to the way things used to be before cancer changed everything. But that feeling lasted only until Dad raised his glass for the first toast of the evening. "To David," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for showing us all what courage looks like, and to the miracle of modern medicine that gave us our son back." We all clinked glasses, and I felt a familiar pang at the way Dad credited modern medicine without acknowledging the financial sacrifice that had made David's specific treatment possible. But I'd learned to keep those thoughts to myself. "I have something I want to say," David announced, standing up and looking around the table at each of us. "These past 6 months have taught me a lot about what really matters in life. Fighting cancer changes your perspective on everything: your priorities, your relationships, your understanding of what it means to be grateful." Jessica reached up and squeezed his hand, smiling at him with obvious pride and affection. "I've learned that the most important thing in the world is having people in your life who love you unconditionally," David continued. "People who support your choices and respect your independence even when they might disagree with you. People who treat you like an adult capable of handling your own challenges." Something in his tone made my stomach tighten. The words sounded like gratitude, but there was an undertone that felt like criticism directed specifically at me. "Jessica has been incredible through all of this," David said, turning to smile at his wife. "She never tried to take over or make decisions for me. She supported me without making me feel helpless or incapable. That's what real love looks like, trusting someone to handle their own life while being there to help when they ask for it." The pointed nature of his comments was becoming impossible to ignore. Mom and Dad were nodding along, assuming David was simply expressing appreciation for his wife's support, but I understood the subtext. He was describing the kind of help he valued, Jessica's approach, while implicitly criticizing mine. "I've also learned that honesty is essential in relationships," David continued, and now his eyes were looking directly at me across the table. "Even when people think they're protecting you by hiding things or making decisions behind your back, that dishonesty damages trust. Real family members respect each other enough to tell the truth, even when it's difficult." My face was burning with embarrassment and anger. David was using his remission celebration dinner to publicly criticize me without directly naming what I'd done. It felt like being lectured by someone whose life I'd literally saved. "David," I said quietly, setting down my glass with more force than necessary, "maybe we could talk about this privately later." "Talk about what?" he asked, his expression innocently confused. "I'm just sharing what I've learned about love and trust during my treatment. I think these are important lessons for our whole family." Dad was looking back and forth between us with growing concern. "Is there something going on that your mother and I should know about?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. I could feel Jessica watching me intently, and I had the sudden realization that this entire speech had been planned. David wasn't spontaneously sharing his insights. He was deliberately forcing a confrontation at a family gathering where he knew I'd be reluctant to defend myself. "Nothing's going on," I said carefully. "David's been through a lot, and I think we should just focus on celebrating his recovery tonight." "Actually," David said, "I think Mom and Dad deserve to know the truth about some things." My heart started pounding. He wasn't going to do this. He couldn't be planning to reveal my payment for his treatment in front of our parents, using it as a weapon to humiliate me at what was supposed to be a celebration dinner. "David, please," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Not tonight." But he ignored my plea and turned to face our parents directly. "Mom, Dad, I found out a few weeks ago that Sarah has been lying to all of us for months. The immunotherapy treatment I received wasn't covered by insurance like we thought. Sarah paid for it herself, $20,000, and then let us all believe it was an insurance approval. The silence that followed felt like the moment after a bomb explodes, when your ears are ringing and you can't quite process what just happened. Mom's fork clattered to her plate, and Dad's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, surprise, and then something that looked uncomfortably like anger. "Sarah," Mom said slowly, "is this true?" I looked around the table at the faces of my family members, seeing my secret reflected back at me through their eyes. What I'd thought of as a generous sacrifice, they were now seeing as deception and manipulation. "Yes, it's true," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I used my inheritance from Grandma Rose and my savings to pay for David's treatment. I didn't tell anyone because I wanted it to be a gift, a way to make sure David got the best possible care." Dad leaned back in his chair, studying me with an expression I'd never seen before. $20,000, Sarah? You spent $20,000 without discussing it with anyone? "I spent my own money to save my brother's life," I said, feeling defensive anger rising in my chest. "I don't understand why that's being treated like a crime." "It's not about the money," Jessica spoke up for the first time, her voice crisp with barely controlled frustration. "It's about the lying. It's about making decisions that affected our family without including us in those decisions." "How did it affect you negatively?" I asked, turning to face her directly. "David got better treatment than he would have otherwise. He responded better and faster than anyone expected. He's sitting here healthy tonight because of that treatment. He's sitting here healthy tonight because he's strong and because he had excellent medical care," Jessica shot back. "You don't get to take credit for saving his life just because you wrote a check." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'm not trying to take credit for anything. I'm just trying to understand why helping my family is being treated like a betrayal. "Because you made us all look like fools," David said, his voice harder than I'd ever heard it. "For months, we thanked God and the insurance company for approving treatment we couldn't afford. We felt grateful and lucky and blessed. And the whole time, you were sitting there knowing it was all a lie." "It wasn't a lie," I protested. "I just didn't tell you where the money came from because I didn't want you to feel guilty or indebted. I wanted you to focus on getting well, not on worrying about finances." "That wasn't your choice to make," Dad said firmly, and the disappointment in his voice cut deeper than any anger could have. "Sarah, we raised you to understand that family members don't keep secrets from each other, especially secrets this big." I felt tears starting to gather in my eyes, but I was determined not to cry in front of them. I was trying to help. I was trying to do something good for our family. "By lying to us for 6 months?" Mom asked, her voice quiet but hurt. "By letting us worry about finances and insurance coverage when you knew the whole time that you'd already taken care of everything?" "Yes," I said, standing up abruptly and throwing my napkin on the table. "I lied to you because I love you. I gave up everything I had saved because I couldn't stand the thought of David dying when there was a treatment available that might save him. I'm sorry if that makes me a terrible person." I headed toward the door, but David's voice stopped me before I could leave the dining room. "Sarah, wait. We're not saying you're a terrible person. We're saying you need to understand that good intentions don't excuse dishonest behavior." I turned around to face him, this brother I'd loved and protected my entire life, who was now lecturing me about honesty while his wife nodded approvingly beside him. "You know what, David? You're absolutely right. I should have been honest from the beginning. I should have told you that I was the one paying for your treatment. I should have told you that I gave up my savings, my plans for graduate school, my down payment for a house, so that you could have the best possible chance at beating cancer. I should have made sure you understood exactly what I was sacrificing so you could live." My voice was rising, but I couldn't stop myself. Months of unacknowledged resentment were pouring out of me. I should have told you that I moved to a smaller apartment to afford the payments. I should have mentioned that I took on extra freelance work and gave up every luxury in my life to make sure the money was available when you needed it. I should have been completely honest about the fact that saving your life cost me every dream I'd been working toward. The room was completely silent now. Everyone's staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to alarm. And you know what else I should have been honest about? I continued, my voice cracking with emotion. I should have told you that I expected gratitude. I should have admitted that I thought you'd be thankful instead of angry. I should have been honest about the fact that watching you plan to move away from our family the moment you got healthy felt like a slap in the face. Sarah, Mom said softly, reaching toward me, but I stepped away from her outstretched hand. No, Mom. David wants honesty, so let's be completely honest. I'm hurt. I'm angry. I feel used and unappreciated and completely invisible in my own family. I gave everything I had to help David, and instead of gratitude, I get lectures about respecting his independence and treating him like an adult. I looked directly at David, who was staring at me with wide eyes. You want to know what treating you like an adult would have looked like? It would have looked like me letting you and Jessica figure out your own solution to paying for experimental cancer treatment. It would have looked like me saying good luck and keeping my money for my own future. That's not what I meant, David said quietly. Isn't it? I asked, because that's what respecting your independence and autonomy would have actually meant. Letting you handle your own problems without interference from your controlling little sister. I grabbed my purse from the side table where I'd left it and headed for the front door. Behind me, I could hear Mom calling my name and Dad telling everyone to calm down, but I was done with this conversation. As I reached for the door handle, Jessica's voice cut through the chaos. Sarah, you're not the victim here. I stopped and turned around slowly. Excuse me? You're acting like we're all ungrateful monsters, but you created this situation, Jessica said, standing up and facing me across the room. You made a unilateral decision about our lives, and then got upset when we didn't react the way you wanted us to. That's manipulation, not generosity. The accusation felt like the final straw. Manipulation? I manipulated you by paying for medical treatment that saved my brother's life? You manipulated us by lying about it, Jessica shot back, by letting us believe something false for months, and then expecting us to be grateful when the truth came out. You put us in a position where we had to either accept your charity gracefully or look like ungrateful jerks. I stared at her for a long moment, this woman who had married into our family and now seemed to understand our dynamics better than I did. You know what, Jessica? You're right. I should have let you and David handle the $20,000 medical bill on your own. I should have respected your independence and your marriage by staying out of your financial problems. Next time one of you needs life-saving medical treatment, I'll be sure to mind my own business. I yanked open the front door and stepped out into the cool evening air, slamming the door behind me hard enough to rattle the windows. As I walked toward my car, I could hear raised voices inside the house, but I didn't look back. Driving home through the familiar streets of Springfield, I felt like I was seeing my hometown through different eyes. Everything looked the same, but something fundamental had shifted. The family dinner I'd been looking forward to all week had turned into a public humiliation, where my greatest act of love had been reframed as emotional manipulation. I thought about David's speech at the beginning of dinner, about learning what real love looked like, and the importance of honesty in relationships. According to him, real love meant supporting someone without making them feel helpless. Real love meant trusting people to handle their own problems. Real love meant being honest, even when it was difficult. By those definitions, I had loved him completely wrong. The next morning, I woke up feeling hollow and exhausted. I'd barely slept, replaying every moment of the dinner conversation and trying to understand how something that had felt so right at the time could have gone so terribly wrong. My phone showed 3 missed calls from Mom and a text from Dad asking me to call him back, but I wasn't ready to rehash the previous night's drama. Instead, I threw myself into work with the determination that surprised even Kate, my boss. I volunteered for every extra project, stayed late every night, and focused all my energy on the marketing campaigns that suddenly seemed like the only stable thing in my life. At least at work, my efforts were appreciated and my contributions were valued. A week passed without any contact from David or Jessica. Mom called twice more, but I let the calls go to voicemail. Dad sent a text asking if we could talk, but I responded with a brief message saying I needed some time to process everything that had happened. I was angry, but underneath the anger was a deep sadness that felt like grief. I was mourning the loss of the family I thought I'd had, The relationships I'd believed were built on mutual love and support. I was mourning the version of myself that had believed sacrifice would be met with gratitude instead of resentment. But most of all, I was mourning the naive belief that being right about something meant you'd be vindicated in the end. I'd been right to pay for David's treatment. He was alive and healthy because of that decision. But being right hadn't protected me from becoming the villain in my own family's story. 2 weeks after the disastrous dinner, Amanda convinced me to meet her for coffee at our usual spot downtown. I'd been avoiding social situations, but she'd threatened to show up at my apartment if I didn't agree to see her. "You look terrible," she said bluntly as I slid into the booth across from her. "When's the last time you slept through the night?" "I'm fine," I lied, though my reflection in the coffee shop window suggested otherwise. I'd lost weight I couldn't afford to lose, and there were dark circles under my eyes that concealer couldn't quite hide. "Sarah, talk to me. What happened at that family dinner? Your mom called my mom asking if I'd heard from you." I'd been dreading this conversation, but Amanda was my oldest friend, and she deserved to know why I'd been avoiding everyone for 2 weeks. I told her everything: the confrontation with David, the dinner from hell, the way my family had made me feel like a criminal for helping them. Amanda listened without interrupting, her expression growing more concerned as the story progressed. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and shook her head slowly. "Okay, I'm going to say something you probably don't want to hear," she said carefully. "But I think your family has a point about the lying part." I felt my defenses rising immediately. "Not you two." "Hear me out," Amanda said, holding up her hand. "What you did was incredibly generous and loving. David is alive because you made that sacrifice, and that's huge. But I can understand why he feels weird about finding out the way he did. So I should have just let him die to preserve his dignity?" "Of course not," Amanda said patiently. "But maybe you could have told him what you were planning before you did it. Maybe you could have said, 'David, I have this money from Grandma Rose, and I want to use it for your treatment. Would you be okay with that?'" I considered this, trying to imagine how that conversation might have gone. He would have said no. He would have told me to keep the money for my own future. "Maybe," Amanda agreed, "but then it would have been his choice to make. And if you'd convinced him to accept the help, he wouldn't have spent months feeling guilty about burdening the insurance company or feeling grateful for a miracle that wasn't actually a miracle." Her words stung because they contained a grain of truth I'd been trying to avoid acknowledging. I had robbed David of the opportunity to make his own choice about accepting my help. I'd decided what was best for him without consulting him, just like our parents had done to him his entire life. "I was trying to protect him," I said weakly. "I know you were," Amanda said gently. "But maybe protecting someone from making their own choices isn't actually protecting them at all. Maybe it's just another way of controlling them." I stared into my coffee cup, feeling the last of my righteous anger draining away. Maybe David had been right. Maybe I had been manipulative, even if I hadn't intended to be. Maybe good intentions weren't enough to excuse dishonest behavior. But even if I could acknowledge my mistakes, I wasn't sure how to fix the damage that had been done. The trust between David and me felt irreparably broken, and I couldn't imagine a way back to the easy closeness we'd once shared. As I drove home from coffee with Amanda, I realized that my family crisis was far from over. The dinner confrontation had been just the beginning of a much larger reckoning that would force all of us to examine our assumptions about love, loyalty, and the price of good intentions. I just had no idea how much worse things were about to get. 3 weeks after my conversation with Amanda, I was beginning to accept that maybe some family relationships couldn't be repaired with apologies and good intentions. I drafted a dozen text messages to David trying to explain myself better, but I deleted them all before sending. What was there left to say that hadn't already been said? I'd saved his life and somehow become the villain of his story in the process. I was working late at the office again, finding solace in the predictable challenges of marketing campaigns and client deadlines, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed my mother's name, and after 3 weeks of avoiding her calls, I finally decided to answer. "Sarah, honey, please don't hang up," Mom said before I could even say hello. "We need to talk about what happened at dinner. This family is falling apart, and I can't stand it anymore." Her voice was strained in a way I'd rarely heard before. Mom had always been the family peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over conflicts and kept everyone talking to each other. The fact that she sounded so defeated told me the situation was affecting her more deeply than I'd realized. "I'm not the one who created this mess, Mom," I said, closing my laptop and leaning back in my desk chair. "I tried to help David, and apparently that was the wrong thing to do." "Nobody thinks you're wrong for wanting to help," Mom said carefully. "But David feels like you made him look foolish, and Jessica feels like you didn't trust her to take care of her own husband. And your father and I feel like we failed somehow because our children can't talk to each other about important things." I rubbed my temples, feeling a familiar headache building behind my eyes. "What do you want me to do, Mom? Do you want me to apologize for paying for David's cancer treatment? Because I'm not going to do that. I'm not sorry I helped him, even if he is." "I want you to talk to your brother," Mom said firmly. "I want you both to stop being stubborn and figure out how to be a family again. David's not moving to Columbus after all." Jessica decided to turn down the job offer because she doesn't want to leave during all this family drama. But instead of bringing us closer together, it's making everything worse. This was news to me. In all my worry about David and Jessica leaving Springfield, I hadn't considered that our family conflict might influence their decision to stay. The fact that Jessica had given up a career opportunity because of our dysfunction made me feel even worse about the whole situation. "Maybe it would be better if they did move," I said quietly. "Maybe some distance would help all of us get some perspective." "Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell," Mom said, using my full name in the tone that had terrified me as a child. "I did not raise you to give up on family when things get difficult. I don't care who said what or who hurt whose feelings. You and David are going to figure this out." "And if we can't?" I asked. "Then you'll keep trying until you do," Mom said with finality. "I'm hosting Sunday dinner this weekend, and I expect both of you to be there. No excuses, no avoiding each other. We're going to sit down like adults and work through this mess." I wanted to argue, but there was something in Mom's voice that reminded me she was still our mother, regardless of how old David and I had gotten. She was pulling rank, and despite everything that had happened, I wasn't quite ready to defy her completely. "Fine," I said, "but I'm not apologizing for helping him." "I'm not asking you to," Mom replied. "I'm just asking you to listen. Really listen, not just wait for your turn to talk." After hanging up with Mom, I sat in my empty office building, trying to imagine how Sunday dinner could possibly go well. Every conversation with David since he'd learned about my payment had devolved into arguments about honesty and autonomy. I couldn't see how sitting around Mom's dining room table would change anything. But I'd underestimated how much the situation was affecting our parents. When I arrived at their house on Sunday, I found David's car already in the driveway. My stomach clenched with anxiety as I walked up the familiar front steps, unsure what kind of reception I'd receive inside. Mom met me at the door with a hug that lasted longer than usual, and I could see the strain of the past few weeks in the lines around her eyes. "Thank you for coming," she whispered in my ear. "I know this isn't easy." In the living room, I found David and Jessica sitting on the couch, both looking as uncomfortable as I felt. Dad was in his recliner with a serious expression that suggested Mom had given him the same lecture about family unity that she'd given me. "All right," Mom said, settling into her chair once we were all gathered. "Before we eat, we're going to clear the air about a few things. I've been thinking about this situation for weeks, and I have some things to say to all of you." She looked around the room with the stern expression she'd worn when David and I were children and had been caught fighting over toys or privileges. "First, Sarah, what you did for David was incredibly generous and loving. You gave up your savings and your plans to make sure your brother got the best possible medical care, and that kind of sacrifice deserves recognition, not criticism." I felt tears starting to well up at finally hearing someone acknowledge what I'd tried to do for David. "However," Mom continued, turning her gaze to me, "you handled it wrong. You should have talked to David and Jessica before making such a significant decision about their lives. By keeping it secret, you made them feel manipulated, and that wasn't fair to them." I nodded reluctantly, still stinging from the criticism but understanding her point. "David," Mom said, shifting her attention to my brother, "your sister saved your life. The treatment she paid for is the reason you're sitting here healthy today instead of going through months more of chemotherapy. The way you've treated her since finding out is shameful." David's face flushed, but he didn't interrupt. "Yes, she should have been honest with you from the beginning. Mom continued, but her intentions were pure, and the result was that you got well faster and with fewer side effects than you would have otherwise. A little gratitude wouldn't kill you. I am grateful, David said quietly. I just wish she'd trusted me enough to discuss it with me first. And Jessica, Mom said, turning to my sister-in-law, I understand that you felt excluded from decisions about your husband's care. But Sarah has been part of this family for 29 years, and she's earned the right to care about David's well-being. Her involvement wasn't about not trusting you. It was about loving her brother. Jessica looked down at her hands, clearly uncomfortable being called out by her mother-in-law. Now, Mom said, clasping her hands together, here's what's going to happen. We're going to eat dinner like a civilized family. We're going to talk about David's recovery, and Sarah's work, and Jessica's job, and Dad's garden. We're going to remember that we love each other despite our flaws and mistakes. Dad cleared his throat. Your mother's right. This family has been through enough stress this year without creating more problems for ourselves. Life's too short to stay angry at people who love you, even when they show that love imperfectly. The dinner that followed was awkward at first, but gradually the familiar rhythms of family conversation began to emerge. David asked about my work projects, and I inquired about his plans now that his treatment was finished. Jessica mentioned that the hospital had offered her additional training opportunities, and Dad talked about the vegetable garden he was planning for spring. It wasn't the easy closeness we'd shared during David's treatment, but it was a start towards something resembling normalcy. After dinner, while Mom and Jessica were clearing the table, David approached me in the living room where I was looking through photo albums with Dad. Sarah, can we talk privately for a minute? He asked. My heart rate spiked, but I nodded and followed him out to the back porch where we'd had countless conversations growing up. I owe you an apology, David said, settling into one of Mom's wicker chairs. Not for being upset about how you handled the payment, but for the way I've treated you since then. Mom's right. You saved my life, and I've been acting like that doesn't matter. I sat down across from him, surprised by his directness. I owe you an apology too. I should have talked to you before making such a big decision about your medical care. I was so focused on making sure you got well that I didn't think about how it would feel from your perspective. Why didn't you tell me? David asked. I keep trying to understand why you thought keeping it secret was better than being honest. I considered the question carefully, wanting to give him an honest answer. Because I was afraid you'd say no. I was afraid you'd tell me to keep the money for my own future, and then you'd end up with a less effective treatment because of your pride. You might have been right about that, David admitted. If you'd asked me 6 months ago whether you should spend your inheritance on my medical bills, I probably would have told you absolutely not. See? I said. That's exactly why I didn't ask. But Sarah, that should have been my choice to make, David said gently. Even if it was the wrong choice, even if it meant I got sicker or took longer to recover, part of being an adult is having the right to make your own mistakes. I understood what he was saying intellectually, but emotionally it was harder to accept. I couldn't risk it, David. I couldn't take the chance that your pride would cost you your life. You're my big brother. I've looked up to you my entire life. The idea of losing you when there was something I could do to prevent it was unbearable. David was quiet for a long moment, staring out at Mom's flower garden in the fading evening light. I get that, he said finally. And I'm grateful, Sarah. More grateful than I've been able to express because I was so angry about the lying part. But you have to understand that finding out the way I did made me feel like a charity case. Like everyone in my life thought I was too weak or incompetent to handle my own problems. That's not how I saw you at all, I protested. I saw you as someone I loved who was facing an impossible situation. The money wasn't charity. It was family helping family. I know that now, David said. But at the time, it felt like pity. It felt like you thought I was pathetic. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, both of us processing the conversation and the emotions we'd been carrying for weeks. So where do we go from here? I asked eventually. I think we start over, David said. I think we acknowledge that we both made mistakes and try to do better going forward. I think we remember that we're family, and family is supposed to forgive each other for being imperfect. I'd like that, I said, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. And Sarah? David said as we prepared to go back inside. Thank you. For the treatment, for the sacrifice, for caring enough about me to give up so much. I should have said that weeks ago. I hugged my brother then, really hugged him for the first time since his diagnosis. It felt like coming home after a long journey through unfamiliar territory. The weeks that followed weren't perfect, but they were better. David and I slowly rebuilt our relationship, learning to communicate more directly about our feelings and expectations. Jessica remained somewhat distant, but she made an effort to include me in conversations and family plans. Most importantly, I learned something valuable about the difference between helping and controlling. Love wasn't about making decisions for other people, even when those decisions were in their best interest. Love was about offering support and respecting people's autonomy to accept or decline that support. I also learned that good intentions weren't enough to prevent hurt feelings or damaged relationships. Impact mattered more than intent, and even well-meaning actions could cause harm if they weren't handled thoughtfully. 6 months later, David was officially declared cancer-free with no signs of recurrence. He'd started his own handyman business and was doing well enough to hire an assistant. Jessica had been promoted to head nurse in her department, and I had started graduate school part-time, using a combination of student loans and the small amount I'd managed to save since depleting my inheritance. We still gathered for Sunday dinners at Mom and Dad's house, and the conversation flowed more naturally than it had in years. David would update us on his business prospects, Jessica would share stories from her work at the hospital, and I would talk about my graduate classes and marketing projects. One evening, as I was helping Mom clear the dinner dishes, she pulled me aside in the kitchen. "I'm proud of you, Sarah," she said quietly. "For what you did for David, yes, but also for how you've handled everything since then. It takes maturity to admit when you've made mistakes and work to fix them." "I'm still learning," I said. "It's harder than I thought to figure out when helping becomes controlling." "That's a lesson most people never learn," Mom said. "The fact that you're thinking about it means you're growing." As I drove home that night, I reflected on how much my understanding of family loyalty had evolved over the past year. I'd started out believing that love meant sacrificing everything for the people you cared about, regardless of whether they wanted or appreciated those sacrifices. Now I understood that real love meant respecting people enough to let them make their own choices, even when those choices were difficult to watch. It meant offering support without strings attached, and accepting that gratitude couldn't be demanded or expected. I thought about the $20,000 I'd spent on David's treatment, and realized I still didn't regret the decision. David was alive and healthy, and that outcome was worth every penny I'd sacrificed. But I'd learned to handle similar situations differently in the future, with more communication, more respect for others' autonomy, and more awareness of how my actions might be perceived. The experience had changed all of us. David was more appreciative of family support and more open about his feelings. Jessica had learned to trust that my involvement in their lives came from love, rather than judgment. Our parents had developed better skills for mediating family conflicts before they spiraled out of control. And I had learned that being right about something didn't automatically make you the hero of the story. Sometimes good people made choices that hurt other good people, and the path forward required acknowledging those hurts and working to do better. A year after David's diagnosis, we held a celebration dinner to mark his first clean annual scan. This time, there were no hidden agendas or secret resentments, just a family gathering to celebrate a milestone we'd all worked to achieve. As David raised his glass to toast his continued good health, he looked around the table at each of us. "To family," he said simply, "for showing up, for screwing up, for figuring it out together, and for loving each other through all of it." We clinked glasses, and I felt the warmth of belonging that had been missing for so many months. We weren't perfect, and we probably never would be, but we were family, with all the complications and rewards that came with that designation. And sometimes, that was enough. The cancer scare had taught us that life was fragile and unpredictable, that the people we loved could be taken from us without warning. But it had also taught us that families could survive betrayal and misunderstanding if everyone was willing to do the hard work of forgiveness and growth. As I looked around the table at the faces of the people who had shaped my entire world, I realized that the $20,000 I'd spent on David's treatment had bought us more than medical care. It had bought us the opportunity to learn who we really were under pressure, and ultimately, to become better versions of ourselves. That night, driving home through the familiar streets of Springfield, I felt grateful for the messy, complicated, imperfect family I'd been born into. They had driven me crazy, broken my heart, and taught me lessons I never wanted to learn. But they had also loved me through my worst mistakes and helped me become someone I could be proud of. And in the end, that seemed like the truest definition of family I could imagine. 2 months after my confrontation with Amanda, I thought I'd found some peace with the situation. David was continuing his recovery, our family had settled into an uneasy truce, and I was slowly rebuilding my savings while working extra hours at Midwest Insurance. The worst seemed to be behind us, even if our relationships weren't quite what they used to be. Then Jessica called me on a Tuesday evening in late October, her voice tight with an emotion I couldn't immediately identify. "Sarah, we need to talk. Can you meet me at Riverside Park tomorrow after work? There are things you need to know about David and your family, things that are going to change everything." Something in her tone made my blood run cold. "Jessica, what's going on? Is David okay? Is his cancer back?" "David's fine medically," she said carefully, "but there are other issues. Issues I can't discuss over the phone. Please, just meet me tomorrow at 6. This conversation is long overdue." I spent the entire next day distracted at work, running through every possible scenario in my mind. Had David's treatment failed? Was there some complication the doctors hadn't told us about? Had Jessica discovered something terrible about our family that I didn't know? When I arrived at Riverside Park the next evening, I found Jessica sitting on a bench overlooking the small lake where David and I had learned to fish as children. She was still wearing her nurse's scrubs from her shift at the hospital, and her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail that suggested she'd been running her hands through it with stress. "Thank you for coming," she said as I sat down beside her. "I wasn't sure you would after everything that's happened between us." "Of course I came," I said. "You sounded upset on the phone. What's going on?" Jessica stared out at the water for a long moment before turning to face me. "Sarah, I owe you an enormous apology. Not just for how I've treated you since David found out about the treatment payment, but for things you don't even know about yet." My heart rate accelerated. "What things?" "I need to start at the beginning," Jessica said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The night David confronted you about paying for his treatment, I was the one who pushed him to do it. I was angry and felt undermined, and I convinced him that you had manipulated all of us. I thought you were trying to play the hero at our expense. This wasn't entirely surprising to me. I'd suspected Jessica was behind some of David's anger, though hearing her admit it still stung. But that's not the worst part," Jessica continued. "After that dinner at your parents' house when everything exploded, David and I had a series of conversations that revealed things about your family that I don't think you know. Things that make your sacrifice for David even more significant than I originally understood." "What are you talking about?" I asked, feeling increasingly anxious about where this conversation was heading. Jessica reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. 3 weeks ago, I was helping David organize some old paperwork when I found this letter tucked inside a book he'd borrowed from your father. It's from a collection agency, addressed to your dad, dated from 2 years ago. She handed me the letter, and I unfolded it with trembling hands. The letterhead was from a debt collection company I'd never heard of, and the amount listed made me gasp. $37,000 in gambling debts, with warnings about legal action if payment wasn't received within 30 days. "I don't understand," I said, reading the letter again to make sure I hadn't misread the numbers. "Dad doesn't gamble. He's always been careful with money." "That's what I thought too," Jessica said sadly. "But when I showed this to David, he told me things about your father that apparently everyone in your family knows except you. Sarah, your dad has had a gambling problem for years. The reason he lost his job at the GM plant wasn't because of downsizing like you were told. He was fired for stealing money from the employee pension fund to cover gambling debts." The words felt like physical blows. "That's impossible. Dad worked at GM for 30 years. He retired with full benefits. He was allowed to retire quietly instead of being prosecuted, but only because he agreed to pay back what he'd stolen." Jessica continued gently. "That's why your parents' house has been mortgaged and remortgaged so many times. That's why your mother works at the accounting firm instead of enjoying retirement. They've been struggling financially for years because of your father's addiction. I felt like the ground was shifting beneath me. Everything I thought I knew about my family's financial situation had been built on lies. How do you know all this? Because David finally told me the truth after I found that letter, Jessica said. He's known about your father's gambling for years, but he was sworn to secrecy. Your parents made him promise never to tell you because they were ashamed and didn't want to burden you with their problems. The implications were starting to hit me like a series of punches to the gut. So when I paid for David's treatment, you were using money your family desperately needed, Jessica finished for me. Money that could have helped your parents get out of debt or given your mother a chance to stop working. And instead of telling you the truth so you could make an informed decision, they all let you spend your inheritance on David's medical bills while they continued to struggle with their own financial crisis. I buried my face in my hands, feeling sick to my stomach. Oh my God, I had no idea. All this time I thought I was being generous, but I was actually being selfish. I should have been helping Mom and Dad, not David. No, Sarah, Jessica said firmly, placing her hand on my arm. You weren't being selfish. You were being lied to. Your entire family conspired to keep you in the dark about their real situation so you wouldn't feel obligated to help them. They were protecting their pride at your expense. I looked up at her, trying to process the magnitude of what she was telling me. But David's treatment was so expensive. If they needed money so badly, why didn't they tell me? Why didn't they ask me to help with their debts instead of letting me spend everything on his medical care? Because they're proud and stubborn, and because they've been covering up your father's addiction for so long that lying about it has become second nature, Jessica said. And because David felt guilty about needing expensive medical treatment when he knew his parents were already in financial trouble. When you offered to pay for the immunotherapy, he was relieved that the burden wasn't falling on them. But he was angry when he found out I'd paid for it, I said, confused by the contradiction. He was angry because he realized you'd made a huge financial sacrifice based on incomplete information, Jessica explained. If you'd known about your parents' debts, you might have chosen to help them instead of him. Or you might have found a way to help both situations. But by keeping you in the dark, they took away your ability to make a fully informed choice about how to use your inheritance. I stood up abruptly and walked to the edge of the lake, trying to organize my thoughts. The revelation that my father had a gambling addiction was shocking enough, but the idea that my entire family had collaborated to hide their financial problems from me felt like a betrayal that cut even deeper than David's initial anger about the treatment payment. There's more, isn't there? I asked, not turning around to face Jessica. Yes, she said quietly. Sarah, the reason David and I were planning to move to Columbus wasn't just because of the job opportunity. It was because we were trying to get away from the constant financial pressure from your parents. Your father has been asking David for money regularly, sometimes subtly and sometimes not so subtly. He even suggested that David should ask you for help, since you were clearly, quote, good with money and had been able to afford his medical treatment. I spun around, staring at her in disbelief. Dad wanted David to ask me for more money? Multiple times, Jessica confirmed. He was convinced that since you'd spent $20,000 on David's treatment, you must have access to more money than you'd let on. He kept suggesting that David should find out how much you really had saved, and whether you'd be willing to help the family with their, quote, temporary financial difficulties. The betrayal felt complete now. Not only had my family hidden their problems from me, but they'd been actively strategizing about how to get more money from me based on their assumption that my sacrifice for David meant I had unlimited resources. Is that why David was so angry about the lying? I asked. Because he was afraid I'd find out about Dad's gambling and realize the family needed help with that instead? Partly, Jessica said, but also because he felt guilty. He knew that if you understood the full picture of your family's finances, you might not have spent every penny of your inheritance on his medical care. He felt like he'd benefited from your ignorance at your parents' expense. I sat back down on the bench, feeling emotionally and physically exhausted. Jessica, why are you telling me all this now? Why not months ago when I first paid for the treatment? Jessica looked down at her hands, clearly struggling with her own emotions. Because I was angry with you for what I saw as manipulation and control. I thought you were trying to insert yourself into our marriage and our medical decisions. I didn't understand that you were actually the one being manipulated by people who knew you well enough to predict exactly how you'd respond to David's crisis. What changed your mind? Last week, your father cornered me at the grocery store, Jessica said, her voice hardening with anger. He asked if David had, quote, talked to Sarah yet about helping with some family expenses. When I told him that you and David were still working through your relationship issues, he suggested that maybe I should approach you directly. Since you and I were both, quote, practical women who understood the importance of family loyalty. I felt a fresh wave of nausea. He wanted you to ask me for money? He wanted me to find out how much money you actually have and whether you'd be willing to help them avoid foreclosure on their house, Jessica said. He said it would be a shame if they lost their home when their daughter was clearly wealthy enough to prevent it. He kept emphasizing how generous you'd been with David's medical bills, and how that proved you understood the importance of helping family in crisis. The manipulation was breathtaking in its calculated nature. My father had observed my response to David's cancer diagnosis and concluded that I was a reliable source of financial rescue for the family. He was now orchestrating a campaign to access whatever resources he believed I had left. That's when I realized what had really happened, Jessica continued. You weren't trying to control David's medical care or insert yourself into our marriage. You were responding exactly the way your family knew you would respond when presented with a crisis involving someone you loved. They've probably been counting on your generosity and your sense of family obligation for years. I thought back to other instances over the years when family members had needed help, and I'd automatically stepped in to provide it. The time I'd co-signed a loan for David when his credit was bad. The numerous occasions I'd covered restaurant bills or movie tickets when Mom and Dad claimed to have forgotten their wallets. The Christmas gifts I'd bought for extended family members that Mom had asked me to purchase because she was short on time. How many of those instances had actually been orchestrated requests for financial help, disguised as casual favors? Sarah, there's something else, Jessica said, interrupting my painful trip down memory lane. Your mother called me yesterday. She wanted to know if David and I would be coming to Sunday dinner this week, because she was planning to make your favorite dessert as a, quote, peace offering. She said she thought the family had been too hard on you and that it was time to bring Sarah back into the fold. That sounds nice, I said, though something in Jessica's tone suggested there was more to the story. It would be, except she followed up by asking if I thought you were still financially comfortable after spending so much on David's treatment. She said she was worried about your well-being and wanted to make sure you weren't struggling to rebuild your savings. The pattern was becoming sickeningly clear. My family wasn't ready to welcome me back because they'd realized their treatment of me had been unfair. They were ready to reconcile because they needed to assess my current financial situation and determine whether I remained a viable source of future assistance. I can't believe this, I said, standing up again and pacing along the lakefront. My entire family has been treating me like a walking ATM, and I never even realized it. I don't think it started out that way, Jessica said gently. I think your parents genuinely appreciated your help over the years, and your generosity became something they relied on without fully acknowledging what they were doing. But your father's gambling problem has made their financial situation increasingly desperate, and desperate people sometimes do things they wouldn't normally consider. I stopped pacing and looked at Jessica directly. What am I supposed to do with this information? How am I supposed to face my family knowing what I know now? I think you need to decide what kind of relationship you want to have with them going forward, Jessica said. And I think you need to make that decision based on complete information rather than the partial truths they've been feeding you for years. Do you think David knows about Dad's plan to get more money from me? Jessica hesitated before answering. I think David suspects something, but he's been so focused on his own recovery and our marriage that he hasn't paid close attention to your parents' financial schemes. When I told him about my conversation with your father at the grocery store, he was genuinely shocked. I don't think he realized how calculated their approach to you has become. I sat back down on the bench, feeling like I needed to anchor myself to something solid while my understanding of my family relationships crumbled around me. Jessica, why are you telling me all this? Why are you risking your relationship with my family to warn me about their intentions? Jessica was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening water. Because I realized that I owe you more than an apology. I owe you the truth. When David was first diagnosed, I was terrified that we wouldn't be able to afford the treatment he needed. I was working double shifts and picking up extra assignments, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. I was losing sleep, wondering how we were going to pay for his care without bankrupting ourselves, or asking for help from family members who couldn't afford to help us. She turned to look at me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Then suddenly, David's treatment was approved and covered, and I felt like we'd been saved by a miracle. I was so grateful that I didn't question it too closely. I should have realized that insurance companies don't typically approve expensive experimental treatments without extensive documentation and appeals processes. You had other things to worry about, I said. But when I found out you'd paid for everything, my first reaction was anger instead of gratitude, Jessica continued. I felt like you'd made me look incompetent as a wife, like you'd stepped in because you didn't trust me to take care of my own husband. I was so focused on my wounded pride that I couldn't see your actions for what they really were, an incredible act of love and sacrifice. Jessica wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Sarah, you gave up your future to save David's life. You spent every penny you'd saved, gave up your plans for graduate school, moved to a smaller apartment, and took on extra work to make sure David got the best possible medical care. And instead of being grateful, I encouraged him to be angry with you for not asking permission first. You were protecting your marriage, I said. I can understand that. I was protecting my ego, Jessica corrected. And in doing so, I helped create a situation where your incredible generosity was reframed as manipulation and control. I helped turn you into the villain of a story where you should have been recognized as the hero. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us processing the complexity of the family dynamics that had been revealed. What happens now? I asked finally. Now you get to decide how much of yourself you're willing to sacrifice for people who have been taking advantage of your love and generosity, Jessica said. And whatever you decide, you'll have my support and David's support. We both recognize now that we misjudged you terribly. What about my parents? What about their financial problems? Jessica shrugged. Your father's gambling addiction is his responsibility to address, not yours. If he's accumulated $37,000 in debt, that's the consequence of his choices, not a crisis you're obligated to solve. Your parents are adults who have been making their own decisions about money for decades. The fact that those decisions have been poor ones doesn't make them your burden to carry. As we walked back to our cars in the gathering darkness, I reflected on how much my understanding of family loyalty had shifted over the past year. I'd started out believing that love meant sacrificing everything for the people you cared about, then learned that real love required respecting people's autonomy to make their own choices. Now I was learning a third lesson, that love also required recognizing when people were taking advantage of your generosity and being willing to protect yourself from exploitation, even when that exploitation came from family members who claimed to care about you. Jessica, I said as we reached our cars, thank you for telling me the truth. I know it wasn't easy, and I know it might cause problems for you with my family. Sarah, you literally saved my husband's life, Jessica said firmly. The least I could do was save you from being taken advantage of by people who should be protecting you instead of using you. Driving home that night, I felt a strange combination of clarity and sadness. The truth about my family's financial situation and their calculated approach to my resources was painful to accept, but it also explained so many interactions and conversations that had never quite made sense to me before. I thought about my father asking David to talk to Sarah about family expenses, about my mother's sudden interest in my financial well-being, about the years of small requests and favors that I'd automatically fulfilled without questioning their necessity or frequency. I realized that my family had been conditioning me for years to be their financial safety net, normalizing requests for help and teaching me to measure my worth by my willingness to solve their problems with my resources. But I also realized that understanding their manipulation didn't automatically erase my love for them or my desire to help them when they genuinely needed it. The challenge going forward would be learning to distinguish between legitimate requests for support and calculated attempts to exploit my generosity. Over the next few weeks, I began implementing boundaries I'd never had before. When Mom called to invite me to Sunday dinner, I politely declined, saying I needed some time to process recent revelations about our family dynamics. When Dad texted asking if I could help with a small emergency expense, I responded that I'd be happy to discuss it once he sought professional help for his gambling addiction. The responses to my new boundaries were telling. Mom became tearful and accused me of abandoning the family during their time of need. Dad became angry and suggested that I was being selfish and ungrateful after everything they'd done for me over the years. But David surprised me. When he learned from Jessica about our conversation at the park and about our parents' financial schemes, he called me immediately to apologize again and to offer his support for whatever boundaries I needed to establish. Sarah, I had no idea how calculating they'd become about money, he said during our phone conversation. I knew Dad had gambling problems, but I didn't realize they were strategizing about how to get financial help from you. That's not family loyalty, that's manipulation. I'm still trying to figure out how to handle it, I admitted. I don't want to abandon them completely, but I also can't keep being their automatic solution to every financial crisis. You don't have to choose between helping them and protecting yourself, David said. You can help them by encouraging Dad to get treatment for his addiction and by supporting them emotionally while they work through their problems. But you don't have to bankrupt yourself to enable his gambling or to shield them from the consequences of their financial choices. 6 months later, I'd established a new relationship with my family that felt more honest and sustainable than anything we'd had before. Dad had reluctantly entered a gambling addiction treatment program after I made it clear that my financial support was contingent on his commitment to addressing his underlying problems. Mom had gradually accepted that her decades of enabling Dad's addiction had contributed to their financial instability, and she'd begun attending support groups for families of gamblers. David and I had rebuilt our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect and honest communication. Jessica had become one of my closest friends. Someone I could trust to tell me difficult truths when I needed to hear them. And I had learned to value my own well-being enough to protect it from people who would exploit my love and generosity, even when those people were family members who claimed to have my best interests at heart. The $20,000 I'd spent on David's cancer treatment remained the best investment I'd ever made, but not for the reasons I'd originally thought. It hadn't just saved David's life. It had revealed the true nature of my family relationships and forced all of us to examine our assumptions about love, loyalty, and the difference between helping and enabling. Most importantly, it had taught me that being generous didn't require being naive, and that protecting myself from exploitation wasn't selfish. It was necessary for building relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided sacrifice. As I looked toward the future, I felt grateful for the painful lessons I'd learned, and optimistic about the healthier family dynamics we were slowly building together. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people is refuse to enable their destructive behavior, even when that refusal feels like betrayal. In the end, real family loyalty isn't about sacrificing everything for people who take advantage of your love. It's about caring enough to help them become better versions of themselves, even when that process is difficult and uncomfortable for everyone involved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.